10 prehistoric horrors archaeologists found in America. Number 10. Danger Cave and the 11,000 years the desert refused to erase. In 1949, the archaeologist Jesse Jennings arrived at a limestone cave carved into a dry mountainside above the Bonneville Salt Flats, a few miles from Wendover, Utah, on a floor of the Great Basin so parched that early visitors named the cave for a boulder that had once nearly killed one of them. Jennings, then of the University of Utah, spent the next several years excavating a cave floor that turned out to hold not one occupation, but dozens, stacked directly on top of each other across a span of time that predates the pyramids by roughly 6,000 years. His full report, published in 1957, coined a term that reshaped how archaeologists understood the entire American West: the desert culture, a way of life adapted so precisely to scarcity that it barely changed for millennia. The lowest layers at Danger Cave, designated stratum D2, date to somewhere between 10,000 and 9,000 years ago. Radiocarbon testing on material recovered since has pushed the earliest human presence at the site back roughly 11,000 years, meaning people were returning to this exact cave for longer than agriculture has existed anywhere on Earth, longer than the wheel, longer than any language spoken today has had a name. What makes Danger Cave valuable to archaeologists is not treasure, it is dryness. The cave's stable, arid interior preserved basketry, cordage, moccasins, and something far less glamorous and far more revealing: human coprolites, fossilized waste, sealed in dust for thousands of years and never given the chance to rot. In research conducted across the 1970s, the University of Utah parasitologist Gary Fry examined those coprolites and found something that had been living inside the people of Danger Cave the entire time. 5 separate samples carried the eggs of Enterobius vermicularis, the human pinworm, making this the oldest confirmed instance of a human intestinal parasite anywhere in the archaeological record of the Americas. A follow-up study, published in the journal Science in 1969, identified a second, uglier resident: eggs from an acanthocephalon, a thorny-headed worm that spends part of its life cycle inside rodents before infecting whatever eats them raw. Not a curse, not a plague, a biological tax paid quietly for 11,000 years by people who had no alternative water source, no alternative food chain, and no version of this desert that wasn't already this hard. The coprolites carry the diet too, and the diet tells its own story of a shrinking, precarious world. Seeds from pickleweed, a salt-tolerant shrub that only became a dietary staple after roughly 8,700 years ago, appear consistently in the later samples, precisely the period when the last remnants of Ice Age Lake Bonneville were evaporating into the salt flat that still surrounds the cave today. The wetlands that once supported richer hunting were disappearing in real time, and the coprolites record the exact moment people started eating what remained instead of what they preferred. There is a version of American prehistory that imagines the desert West as empty until settlers arrive to make it useful. Danger Cave argues the opposite in the most intimate evidence a body can leave behind. People did not merely survive here. They returned, generation after generation, to the same cave mouth, eating the same shrinking margin of food, carrying the same parasites their grandparents carried, across a span of time that makes the whole of recorded American history look like the final few seconds of a much longer recording. A parasite is a small, patient kind of horror, one that takes 11,000 years to prove its point. The next entry on this list needed no patience at all. It took less than a second, and it left a man kneeling in exactly the position death found him in. Number 9. Lost John and the 6-ton mistake at the bottom of Mammoth Cave. Deep inside the longest cave system ever mapped on Earth, in a passage of Kentucky's Mammoth Cave now included on the historic tour route, a man once knelt in absolute darkness, working a vein of glittering mineral crystal out of the ceiling above him. He was mining gypsum, or possibly the related minerals mirabilite and epsomite, both of which prehistoric miners extracted from these passages for reasons archaeologists still cannot fully explain: trade, medicine, or ritual use, with no single artifact confirming which. To reach this vein, he had already walked well beyond any natural light, guided only by the reed torches whose charred remains still mark the cave walls today. Then the ceiling he was working gave way. On the 7th of June, 1935, cave guides Lyman Cutliff and Grover Campbell, leading a civilian Conservation Corps crew cutting a new tourist trail, found him exactly where the collapse had left him. A man in his mid-40s, roughly 5 feet 3 inches tall, pinned beneath a boulder estimated at 6 tons, in a kneeling position that suggested he never had time to stand. Mammoth Cave's climate, cool, dry, and remarkably stable year-round, had done what Egypt's sand and Peru's altitude do for very different reasons. It had mummified him. His skin, his flesh, even internal tissue, remained intact after a span of time no single study has managed to pin down with confidence. Cloth recovered with the body has been dated to roughly 445 years before the Common Era by one analysis. Separate isotopic testing has placed him anywhere from 10 years before the Common Era to the year 130 after it. What both approaches agree on is the general tradition he belonged to: a sustained history of underground mineral extraction at Mammoth and the adjoining Salts Cave that the archaeologist Patty Jo Watson, working at the site since 1963, has documented through more than 50 radiocarbon dates spanning roughly 1,000 years of continuous use. Rescuers nicknamed him Lost John. His tools lay where he had set them down. Beside the tools, still recognizable after thousands of years in total darkness, sat his lunch, food he had packed expecting to eat it on the walk back out. His tools, his unfinished lunch, the exact kneeling angle of a body that never got the chance to stand back up. That is the complete inventory of an ordinary day, ended by physics, preserved by geology, somewhere between 2,000 and 2,400 years before anyone thought to write a single word down anywhere on this continent. Mammoth Cave's mineral deposits were valuable enough that people kept returning to mine them for generations after Lost John died, which means his death changed nothing about how the cave was used. It only proved that this particular passage and this particular vein would kill the next person who trusted the ceiling above it. For decades after 1935, Lost John himself was displayed in a glass case near the site of his own death, a tourist attraction built from the accident that killed him. In the 1970s, the National Park Service reversed that decision and reburied him at a location known only to the park superintendent and a small circle of staff, the closest the cave could offer to the privacy his death never had. A single man, crushed by a single stone, shows you what one accident looks like underground. The next entry on this list is the same mechanism at an entirely different scale. Not one person crushed by one rock, but generations of a single animal driven on purpose off the edge of the world. Number 8. Head smashed in, and the cliff that gave itself a name in blood. In the Porcupine Hills of southwestern Alberta, a sandstone cliff drops roughly 10 meters, about the height of a 3-story building, onto a gathering basin that has been collecting bison bone for at least 5,500 years, and, according to excavation seasons in 2021, 2022, and 2024, considerably longer than that. Those digs pulled stone tools and bone fragments from levels dated between roughly 9,000 and 7,500 years old, the oldest material ever recovered at the site, meaning every time archaeologists dig deeper at Head Smashed In, the site gets older. The mechanism itself required no technology beyond landscape and patience. For thousands of years, hunters ancestral to the Blackfoot Confederacy used a network of stone cairns spread across kilometers of open prairie above the cliff to build what amounted to a funnel with no visible walls. Young runners disguised in wolf or bison hide moved a herd gradually into the mouth of that funnel. Once the animals were committed and running at speed, there was no way for a bison, an animal that cannot easily stop or turn once a herd around it is already in motion, to see the drop coming until the ground simply ended. The scale is what the bone bed confirms. Excavations led first by Boyd Wetlaufer in 1949 and continued for decades by Bob Daw of the Royal Alberta Museum starting in 1983 have exposed bison remains stacked as deep as 10 meters below the modern surface, among the deepest cultural deposits anywhere in North America, built entirely from repeated, successful, catastrophic falls. Here is the detail that gives the site its name and its edge. According to Blackfoot oral tradition, a young man once wanted to watch the kill from directly beneath the cliff, tucked into a ledge he believed was safe. The hunt that day worked better than anyone expected. Bison bodies piled higher and higher against the rock face, faster than anyone could account for a person hidden underneath them, until the sheer weight of the fall pinned him against the stone and crushed his skull. When his people found him afterward, they gave the place a name that has outlived every other detail of his life: Estipas Gikikinikots, where we got our heads smashed in. The efficiency the site required should not be mistaken for simplicity. Coordinating a bison jump meant reading wind direction, herd behavior, and the instincts of a genuinely dangerous animal moving at speed. Then executing a plan that could feed a community through winter in a single afternoon, and processing that kill immediately before the meat spoiled, at a scale most modern visitors underestimate completely. In levels dated to roughly 1,600 years ago, recent excavations uncovered a roasting pit so intact that it still held prepared food inside it, untouched since the meal was abandoned. The mainstream reading of Head Smashed In treats it as sophisticated, sustainable resource management, refined and repeated across roughly 200 generations. It is worth holding that alongside a harder fact. Sustainable, for the people who built it, still meant this: whatever the herd experienced in its final seconds, driven at a run toward ground that vanished without warning, happened here on a scale large enough to leave bone 10 meters deep, over and over, for 6,000 years. A cliff that killed by the hundreds, using nothing more complicated than terrain, is one kind of engineered catastrophe. The next entry on this list required no cliff, no herd, and no hunters at all, only a shape drawn into the earth so precisely that archaeologists still cannot agree on who drew it or when. Number 7. The Great Serpent Mound, and the crater nobody meant to build on. In the hill country of Adams County in southern Ohio, a low earthen effigy uncoils across a ridge above Ohio Brush Creek for approximately 1,348 feet, longer than 4 American football fields laid end to end, its body twisting through 7 distinct coils toward a head aligned by most measurements with the setting sun on the summer solstice. It is the largest surviving serpent effigy on Earth. It is also, after more than a century of formal study, still not reliably dated. The Harvard archaeologist Frederick Ward Putnam led the first scientific excavation of the mound in the 1880s and did something rarer than excavate it. He led the campaign to purchase the site outright, very likely saving it from being leveled by a farmer's plow. Putnam's own charcoal samples pointed to construction around 300 years before the Common Era, placing the builders within the Adena culture. For most of the 20th century, that date held. Then, in 1991, a fresh excavation and radiocarbon analysis returned dates centering on the year 1070 of the Common Era, nearly 1,300 years later than Putnam's estimate, and squarely inside the later Fort Ancient culture instead. In 2014, another team produced new radiocarbon results that swung back toward Putnam's original Adena-era dating. Neither side of the debate has managed to fully dismiss the other's evidence, and a growing number of archaeologists now suspect the honest answer is that both are partly right, that the mound was built and later reshaped or rebuilt across more than one distinct period by more than one culture, separated by the better part of 1,000 years. What the dating dispute doesn't touch is stranger, and it sits directly underneath the serpent's coils. The land Serpent Mound rests on lies inside one of only 28 confirmed impact structures in the United States. A crater roughly 8 miles across, gouged into the bedrock by an asteroid or comet strike that geologists date to somewhere between 254 and 330 million years ago. That is not a small gap relative to the mound. It is roughly 300 million years between the impact and anything resembling a human being on this continent. A gap large enough to make any deliberate connection feel almost impossible to argue in good faith. Nothing about the mound's builders, Adena, Fort Ancient, or both, could have known what caused the strange, jumbled bedrock beneath their feet, the mineral deposits, the localized geology that behaves like nowhere else in the region. What they may have noticed is simpler and doesn't require them to have understood any of it. This one specific ridge looks and feels different from the surrounding countryside because the ancient impact's central uplift pushed unusual rock to the surface in exactly this spot. Whether that noticeable strangeness is the reason a serpent was built here, on this ridge, above this creek, rather than on any of the thousands of ordinary ridges nearby, is not a question the evidence can currently answer. It may be coincidence. Coincidence, on this scale, is at least worth sitting with. The mainstream position treats the mound's location as unrelated to the ancient crater beneath it, geology first, monument second, with several 100 million years and no causal thread connecting them. A minority of researchers have argued the correlation is too precise to dismiss so easily, that a civilization capable of aligning an effigy to a solstice sunset was also capable of noticing when the ground itself refused to behave like the ground around it. Neither position currently has the missing evidence to close the argument. A monument with a disputed birthday, built on a scar left by the sky, is one kind of American mystery. The next entry on this list has no mystery about who it belonged to, only an unresolved argument, decades long, over who has the right to say so. Number 6, Spirit Cave, and the mummy nobody was allowed to claim. In 1940, the husband and wife archaeological team of Sidney and Georgia Wheeler excavated a small cave roughly 13 miles east of Fallon, Nevada, and found a man wrapped for burial with real care. A twined rabbit skin blanket, woven reed mats, moccasins on his feet, and the partial or cremated remains of 3 others nearby. The Wheelers, working with the tools and assumptions of their era, estimated the burial at somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 years old. It was a reasonable guess. It was also wrong by a factor of more than 5. New radiocarbon testing conducted at the University of California, Riverside and published in the mid-1990s forced a complete recalculation. The Spirit Cave man had been buried roughly 10,600 years ago, not a regional curiosity, but the oldest deliberately buried human mummy ever identified anywhere in North America, older than the earliest Egyptian mummification by several thousand years. An extraordinary age is not, on its own, a controversy. What turned Spirit Cave into one was the question of who gets to decide what happens to a body that old. In 1997, the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe filed a formal claim under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, seeking the return of an ancestor found on land within their traditional territory. The Federal Bureau of Land Management rejected the claim, arguing that 10,600 years was too vast a gulf to establish clear cultural affiliation with any specific living tribe. The tribe sued. In 2006, a United States District Court in Nevada ruled that the Bureau had dismissed the tribe's evidence without adequately explaining why, sending the case back, unresolved, into another decade of argument. What finally settled it wasn't a legal filing. It was genetics. In 2015, the geneticist Eska Villerslev analyzed DNA recovered from the remains and found a clear genetic affinity between the Spirit caveman and present-day indigenous populations across North and South America. The same kind of evidence gathered in the same decade that was closing similar disputes at ancient burial sites across the American West. On the 22nd of November 2016, 76 years after the Wheelers first opened the cave, the remains were formally repatriated to the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe. They were reburied privately in 2018 at a location the tribe has not disclosed. The mainstream scientific position now treats Spirit Cave as strong genetic evidence for a single deep-time ancestral population connecting Paleo-American remains to modern indigenous nations, resolving a question the skeleton alone could never have answered. What remains undisputed on every side is simpler and harder to sit with. For 19 years, an act of federal skepticism kept a family's ancestor in storage, arguing over a threshold of proof that DNA, when it finally arrived, answered in a single study. Spirit Cave took 19 years and a genome to resolve. The next entry on this list has never been resolved at all, not by a court, not by a laboratory, and not by the tar that has kept her secret for over 10,000 years. Number 5. La Brea Woman, the only person who ever fell into a monster's grave. In the middle of modern Los Angeles, a few hundred meters from the traffic on Wilshire Boulevard, asphalt still seeps up through the ground today, exactly as it has for tens of thousands of years. During the last ice age, that seeping tar trapped and preserved one of the richest deposits of Pleistocene fossils anywhere on the planet. Hundreds of species and millions of individual bones, including the remains of more than 4,000 individual dire wolves alone, alongside saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, ancient bison, and American lions. In 1914, excavators pulled something different out of Pit 10, a partial human skeleton, the only person ever recovered from the entire tar seep, in a location otherwise defined almost exclusively by predators. Radiocarbon dating places her death at approximately 10,220 to 10,250 years ago. She was somewhere between 18 and 25 years old, roughly 4 feet 9 inches tall, and wear on her teeth is consistent with a diet built around stone-ground meal. Her skull was fractured and her jaw broken. For decades, the reasonable assumption was violence, a blow to the head, possibly fatal, before or after she ended up in the asphalt. What makes La Brea Woman particularly unsettling isn't the fracture itself. It's that no test devised since 1914 has been able to say with confidence which explanation is true. A skull can break from a weapon, from a fall, from the sheer geological pressure of 10,000 years spent submerged in shifting tar and sediment. She may be the oldest known instance of human-on-human violence in the Americas. She may be an ordinary young woman who slipped near a tar seep on an ordinary day and never got out. The bone cannot say, and no one currently alive can ask her. For decades, a nearby dog skeleton fed a tidier story, a ritual burial, a companion sent into the afterlife alongside her. It was a compelling theory, repeated on museum placards for years. Then, in a study published in the journal Paleo America, researchers radiocarbon dated the dog directly and found it was only about 3,200 to 3,400 years old, thousands of years younger than the woman beside it. The dog had wandered into the same trap millennia after she died. Proximity was never a relationship. It was coincidence, preserved by the same tar that made the original theory feel so obvious. Not a ritual. Not a companion in death. Two unrelated tragedies separated by 7,000 years that happened to end in the same few square meters of ground. Rancho La Brea remains an active dig today, and the asphalt is still doing exactly what it did to her, seeping, slow and indifferent, through a public park square in one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere. Researchers including Dr. Emily Lindsay at the Brea Tar Pits Museum and radiocarbon specialist Dr. John Southen at the University of California, Irvine continue reanalyzing material from the pits using techniques that didn't exist when she was first excavated. Which means the one mystery on this list still without an answer is also the one most likely, eventually, to get one. She is surrounded permanently by predators that could have killed her and never got the chance to. What actually killed her may never be known. The next entry on this list has the opposite problem. Archaeologists know exactly what buried it. They simply could not stop it from happening in time. Number 4. Marmes rock shelter and the flood that outran an entire excavation. At the confluence of the Snake and Palouse rivers in the dry hill country of southeastern Washington, a rock overhang sheltered Native American burial and habitation for well over 10,000 years. Excavations beginning in 1962, led by Washington State University archaeologist Richard Doherty and geologist Roald Fryxell, recovered human remains and tools eventually radiocarbon dated to roughly 10,750 radiocarbon years, close to 12,700 calendar years, making Marmes, at the time of its excavation, one of the oldest documented human sites anywhere in North America. Then the federal government finished building a dam. The Lower Monumental Dam, under construction downstream on the Snake River for reasons that had nothing to do with archaeology, was scheduled to close its floodgates in February of 1969. Fryxell's team knew the reservoir behind it would eventually submerge the rock shelter completely, and they were given a fixed, non-negotiable deadline to pull as much science out of the ground as physically possible before that happened. A temporary cofferdam was supposed to hold the rising water back long enough to finish. Its pumps failed early. What followed was 5 days of excavation run directly against an incoming reservoir. Fryxell's team built heavy wooden cribs around two of the most promising unexcavated squares, lined the surrounding trenches with plastic sheeting, and buried the entire protected area under roughly 8,000 cubic yards of sand, racing the water the whole time. The team itself would later call the effort a gift to the future, a bet that whatever they couldn't excavate in time might still be recoverable decades or centuries later if the dam were ever altered or removed. The floodgates closed. The water came anyway. By the time it was over, the rock shelter that had produced some of the oldest human remains in North America sat under roughly 40 feet of reservoir, where it remains today. This is not the same kind of ceiling that closes a temple to protect it from tourists, or a tomb to protect it from looters. Nobody at Marmes chose this outcome. It was forced onto a research team by an infrastructure timeline that had already been set in motion long before anyone fully understood what the rock shelter actually contained. The distinction matters. Conservation is a decision made with the evidence already in hand. What happened at Marmes was a bet made in a 5-day panic about material nobody had finished studying yet, buried in exactly the kind of hurry that leaves everyone uncertain, even now, how much of that gift to the future survived intact. The site has not been reopened since. The United States Army Corps of Engineers has rated its underwater conditions satisfactory since 2004, though the reservoir's boat traffic continues to erode the shoreline above it year by year. Whether Marmes is ever excavated again depends entirely on the future of the dam itself, and that future is being argued over right now. A 2023 federal agreement had committed to studying the eventual removal of the lower Snake River dams to help restore collapsing salmon runs, before a 2025 presidential order pulled federal agencies back out of that agreement. Litigation over the dam's future was still active as of this recording, with no resolution and no timeline. Somewhere beneath 40 feet of reservoir water, sealed in plastic and sand a scientist once called a gift to the future, sits one of the most haunting, unfinished sentences in North American archaeology, not lost to time and not protected by choice, but simply outrun by 5 days, by a decision that was never really about the past to begin with. A rock shelter drowned by an argument over water rights and salmon is one kind of loss. The next entry on this list drowned in something even easier to overlook: the assumption that a disease has to arrive by ship. Number 3. The tuberculosis that reached America before Columbus did. For most of the 20th century, the standard account of tuberculosis in the Americas fit in a single sentence. It didn't exist here until Europeans brought it. One more entry on the long list of Old World diseases that devastated indigenous populations after 1492. Skeletal evidence complicated that story for years. Pre-contact bones with lesions that looked like tuberculosis kept turning up at sites across Peru and Chile. But bone lesions alone can be caused by several different diseases, and without genetic confirmation, the standard account held. The confirmation, when it finally came, didn't just support the pre-contact skeletons. It broke the standard account entirely. In 2014, the geneticist Kirsten Boss, working with a team that included researchers at Germany's University of Tübingen, published findings in the journal Nature describing the complete genomes of 3 tuberculosis strains recovered directly from human skeletal remains at Chiribaya Alta, a coastal site in Peru's Osmore Valley. The bones belong to people of the Chiribaya culture, radiocarbon dated to somewhere between the years 1028 and 1280 of the Common Era, solidly 2 to 4 centuries before any European ship reached the Americas. The genomes proved the infection was real. What they revealed next was the part no one expected. The ancient Peruvian tuberculosis strains were not closely related to the human tuberculosis lineages later circulating across Europe and Asia. Genetically, their nearest living relative was Mycobacterium pinnipedii, a strain of tuberculosis that today infects seals and sea lions. That finding requires something specific and unglamorous to have happened. Not a sailor coughing in a crowded port, not a soldier or a trader carrying infection overland. A disease that made the jump from a marine mammal into a coastal human population somewhere along the Pacific Rim, centuries before anyone in Europe had reason to sail toward Peru at all, spreading afterward through exactly the kind of sustained person-to-person contact tuberculosis still relies on today. 2 separate dating methods applied to the wider Mycobacterium tuberculosis family place its most recent common ancestor at under 6,000 years old, young in evolutionary terms for a pathogen this successful. That timeline fits a disease spreading along multiple independent paths around the globe during the current geological epoch, rather than a single point of origin exported later by European contact. Some researchers studying the wider tuberculosis family tree argue for exactly one introduction event into the Americas. Others have proposed several separate ones, arriving by different coastal routes at different times. The seal-to-human genetic link at Chiribaya Alta is not disputed. How many times, and by how many separate paths, that link repeated itself across the pre-contact Americas still is. This is not a forgotten curiosity. Tuberculosis remains one of the deadliest infectious diseases on the planet today, killing more than 1 million people worldwide every year, according to current global health estimates. A pathogen still actively evolving, still spreading through the same close, sustained contact it relied on in Chiribaya Alta 1,000 years ago, long before anyone thought to ask a seal for its family tree. An entire chapter of the medical version of the Columbian Exchange turned out to be wrong, buried in bones no one thought to sequence until the technology finally caught up with the question. The next entry on this list didn't hide a disease, it preserved an entire population, on purpose, one deliberate body at a time, infants included, roughly 2,000 years before Egypt ever wrapped a pharaoh. Number 2, the Chinchorro and the culture that refused to let anyone go unmarked. Along the coastal strip of Chile's Atacama Desert, the driest non-polar environment on Earth, a fishing people known today as the Chinchorro settled the shoreline as early as roughly 7,000 years before the Common Era. Sometime around 5,050 years before the Common Era, they began doing something no other known culture on the planet had yet attempted, deliberately, systematically preserving their dead. The oldest artificially mummified human body ever identified anywhere in the world is Chinchorro. It predates the earliest Egyptian mummification by roughly 2,000 years. The German archaeologist Max Uhle first documented the practice in 1917, though it took decades of subsequent work, much of it led by the Chilean anthropologist Bernardo Ardiaza, to reconstruct exactly what the earliest Chinchorro morticians actually did. In what researchers now call the black mummy technique, practiced roughly between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era, the body was completely taken apart. Skin was removed and set aside. Organs were removed entirely. The skeleton was reinforced from the inside with sticks and reed bundles, repacked and reassembled into something closer to sculpture than corpse. A face remodeled in clay, a wig of human hair fixed to the skull. The entire reconstructed body finally coated in dense black manganese pigment. Later generations shifted to a red ochre finish instead, in what researchers call the Red Mummy period. But the underlying commitment never changed. Here is what separates Chinchorro from every mummification tradition that followed it. Egypt mummified its elite. The Chinchorro mummified almost everyone. Hunters, mothers, elders, and, most strikingly, infants and children who died before they could have earned any status at all. Some of the most elaborately reconstructed Chinchorro mummies belong to babies who lived only days or weeks. Researchers writing in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal have described the entire practice as something closer to an archaeology of grief than an archaeology of power. A coastal desert culture that appears to have decided, collectively and repeatedly across a staggering 4,000 years, that no death in the community was too small or too young to deserve the same painstaking reconstruction as anyone else's. That decision required real labor, repeated for every single loss. A skin removed, a skeleton rebuilt with reeds by hand, a face given back to a person who had one taken by nothing more dramatic than infant mortality on a hard coastline. Multiply that labor across the roughly 4,000 years the practice continued, across a population where child death was common rather than rare, and what looks at first like an unusually elaborate funeral custom starts to look like something closer to an entire society organizing its available time and skill around one shared refusal. Nobody disappears here unmarked. Not the fisherman, not the elder, not the child who never lived long enough to be anything but loved. The Chinchorro mummies survived 7,000 years because the Atacama stayed dry enough for that entire span to do the preserving on its own. That is no longer guaranteed. Conservators studying the mummies in recent years have documented new, active decay, dark splotches of bacterial growth spreading across skin that had remained stable for millennia, traced to rising atmospheric humidity reaching a coastline that used to have none to spare. The same desert that made this unprecedented act of collective care physically possible for 7,000 years is now, within a matter of recent decades, quietly taking that preservation back. In 2021, UNESCO granted the Chinchorro settlements and mummification sites World Heritage status, a recognition that arrived only after the deterioration had already begun. You are looking in the Chinchorro record at the oldest known refusal in human history to let anyone be forgotten simply because they were poor or young or ordinary. It very nearly outlasted the desert that made it possible. The final entry on this list is not about a whole culture's refusal to forget. It is about one single child whose body did something no deliberate mummification ever could. Without any embalming at all, it became the reason nearly everyone on 2 continents can trace their ancestry back to a single point. Number 1. The Anzick child, and the boy who became almost everyone. Picture the Shields River Valley in southern Montana, roughly 12,600 years ago, in the last cold centuries of the Ice Age. A community that makes its living with fluted stone points and long, carefully worked bone and antler tools has just lost a child, 1 to 2 years old, barely old enough to have been fully known by anyone outside his own family. What they do next is not panic, and it is not simple grief. They select more than 100 of their finest tools, stone points, bone rods, antler foreshafts, the kind of equipment a hunting band could not easily replace, and they bury every one of them with him. Before they close the grave, they cover the child and every object beside him in red ochre, a mineral pigment that would have taken real effort to gather and grind, until the entire burial glows the color of the inside of a body. In May of 1968, construction workers Ben Hargis and Calvin Sarver, clearing rock from a sandstone outcrop on the Anzick family property near Wilsall, Montana, broke into that grave by accident. What they found was immediately recognized as extraordinary: more than 100 red ochre-stained tools in direct association with a Clovis-era burial, the fluted point technology that defines the earliest widely recognized toolkit in North America. It remains to date the only human burial ever found directly associated with Clovis tools anywhere on the continent, a singular grave in a landscape that has produced Clovis points by the thousands and Clovis burials exactly once. Subsequent radiocarbon work, refined most recently in a 2018 reanalysis published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, places the burial at approximately 12,600 to 13,000 years old. An extraordinary burial would have been enough on its own. What happened in 2014 made it something else entirely. A team led by the geneticist Morten Rasmussen sequenced the child's full genome and published the results in Nature. The results didn't just confirm his age. They traced his lineage forward through thousands of generations into the present day and found that his people were the direct genetic ancestors of roughly 80% of every indigenous population living anywhere in the Americas today. Not just in Montana, not just in the continental United States, but stretching south through Mexico, through Central America, through the entire spine of South America, to communities living in southern Chile, more than 15,000 kilometers from the grave where he was found. His genome carried the same signature as the Upper Paleolithic Malta population of Siberia, confirming more directly than any stone tool ever could that the ancestors of nearly 2 continents worth of indigenous nations crossed from Asia into the Americas as a single founding population at least 15,000 years ago. Consider what that means in practice. A single small child, dead before the age of 2, too young to have hunted, built, or led anything, became, through nothing he did himself, only through the parents and grandparents whose survival made his birth possible, the genetic thread connecting a hunting camp in Ice Age Montana to hundreds of millions of living people on 2 continents. Consider the chain that had to hold unbroken across 15,000 years and every hazard those years contained: famine, disease, flood, war, cold, ordinary bad luck. Any single break in any single generation and the thread stops. It did not stop. It reached him, and it reached forward from him into now. Not an artifact, not a data point in a genetics paper. A child someone loved enough to bury with everything the community could not afford to lose, and cover in the color of blood, 12,600 years before a bulldozer very nearly erased the evidence that he had ever existed at all. On the 28th of June, 2014, in a ceremony held in the same Shields River Valley where he was found, more than 50 people, including descendants of the family who owned the land and representatives of 6 Native American tribes, gathered to bury him again. They sang, they played drums, they sprinkled the bones with red ochre, just as his own parents had done 12,600 years earlier, a gesture separated from the original burial by every war, migration, language, and civilization the Americas would ever produce, and identical to it anyway. The medicine man who led the ceremony, Larson Medicine Horse, said simply that it brought the boy full circle. You exist, and everyone you have ever loved exists, because a chain of ordinary survival ran unbroken for at least 15,000 years across 2 continents this child's own people never had a map of. The Anzick child is not evidence that the deep past of the Americas was empty, waiting for someone else's history to begin. He is proof that it was never empty at all, that it was, from the very beginning, exactly as complicated, as loved, and as fragile as anything alive today. Whatever else you take from this list, take this. The ground under an entire hemisphere has been holding on to its dead with extraordinary patience, waiting for the science that could finally let them speak. Some of them still haven't been found. Across all 10 of these sites, the mechanism of discovery repeats even when the mechanism of death or preservation does not. None of these stories was legible on its own terms. Every one of them sat in the ground, or in a museum drawer, or under a reservoir, meaning something different than what it turned out to mean, until radiocarbon recalibration, ancient DNA, isotope chemistry, or genome sequencing arrived decades later and rewrote the verdict. Danger Cave's parasites needed a parasitologist. Spirit Cave needed a geneticist to finish what a legal system spent 19 years failing to resolve. The Brea tuberculosis genome needed technology that did not exist when the bones were first excavated. The past these sites hold did not change. Only how much of it anyone was capable of reading did. The same mechanisms are still running today. Head Smashed In got older again in 2024, and will likely get older still the next time someone digs deeper. The Chinchorro mummies are actively decaying right now, for the first time in 7,000 years, as humidity reaches a desert that was never supposed to have any. Marmes rock shelter's fate is still being argued over in federal court, tied to a dam removal fight with no resolution as of this recording. Tuberculosis, the disease first proven pre-Columbian at Chiribaya Alta, still kills more than 1 million people a year. None of this is finished. All of it is still being actively decided, corrected, or lost right now by people who will not live to see how the argument ends. What unites these 10 places is not violence, though several involve it, and it is not mystery, though several keep theirs intact. It is the scale of time working against a species that evolved to think in single lifetimes. Every person on this list, the miner crushed by his own ceiling, the toddler wrapped in ochre, the woman whose skull no one can explain, believed, reasonably, that their world was the only one that had ever mattered. Each of them was wrong about that. Each of them was also, in the way that counts, correct. Their world was real, particular, and worth the extraordinary lengths their communities went to in order to mark it. Prehistoric is not a description of the people. It is a description of the record. The ground under this continent has been holding a far longer, far stranger story than the one written down. It is not finished being read. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.